What's up, guys? This is going to be float betting turn population analysis module. General objective of this session is just to see how the pool is playing against float bets and against follow-up bets, and also break that down by a number of variables as well. So let's start by firing up the main range research report. So we'll be having a look at the CBET flop OOP pop-up. Because it's here, we'll find the pool versus turn float bet data. So just to start off with basic data point, we can see the player pool is falling 53% of the time when facing a float bet on the turn. And let's take a look at the different bet sizings. We can see consistent automatic profit across the different bet sizing ranges. So 1/3, break-even threshold, 25%. We like to add a few percent for card removal effects, etc. But you can see well above the auto profit threshold. Same for half pot, same for 2/3 pot. Same for 80% to pot size. Same for over bet sizings even. We are clearly generating automatic profit. So the sizing we use is usually going to be dependent on the type of hand that we have. But as you can see, if we don't have something very strong, small sizing is going to work very well. Keep the size of the pot small for the river. Let's take a look at the follow-up bet as well. So you can see as a general data point, we have 48% fold equity on the follow-up. And if we break that down by sizing, typically we expect to see 2/3 as being a good sizing for the river. So you can see 50% fold equity with the 2/3. Having said that, we do generate clear auto profit with the half pot follow-up bet. And even the 1/3 appears to generate automatic profit. So we could, of course, run these numbers through an EV calculation, and we often find some sizes are slightly better than others, but you can see that generally betting in this spot is going to be the right thing to do if we have air and we're consistently generating automatic profit for a range of sizings. Recommendation is just to use a 2/3 sizing in this situation. 70% pot, for example, is going to be completely fine, or thereabouts. Okay, so let's take a quick look at any textual considerations here. So we focus on that river follow-up bet. So we have float bet the turn. Let's see if we can get a feel for what kind of runouts we like to see in this situation. Now, one of the things that we noticed, just to take you back to float bet flop triple barrel, is we noticed that seeing as with a cold cooler, when we fire the third barrel on the river, we actually like draws to complete in that situation. So this is a good pattern to be aware of, that when we're the cooler, we often like draws to complete. Whereas if we are triple barrel bluffing, or bluffing the river in any spot really where we're the PFR pre-flop, we generally get more fold equity when draws brick. So it's just something to be aware of. Things are slightly reversed in terms of which variables are favorable for us. But we can see very clearly here that when we float bet the turn and follow up bet the river, we like it when draws complete. Now, of course, we only have flush completes due to the limitations of hand to note filters, but we can usually extend this to say that this represents any spot where a draw completes, whether it's a flush completing or a straight completing. And if they both complete, for example, there's a river card that completes a straight and a flush, it's reasonable to assume that we're going to have a spike in fold equity beyond just the 53% here we see at this data point. So when flush bricks, it's not as good for us. Having said that, if we look at every sizing here, if we assume that 2/3 pots round about the average sizing in the situation, we can see that we are generating fairly consistent automatic profit across most river runouts. However, there are some river runouts to be aware of. And it just so happens that these are the exact same river runouts when we're playing float bet flop triple barrel line that are either very good or very bad for us. So in this situation, you can see that 4 flushes and 4 straights are very good for us. So those are the extreme draw completing rivers. Can you see 60% fold equity on 4 flush? That's the highest data point there. 57 on 4 straights. So once again, normally if we're playing as a PFR, we don't necessarily like 4 to straight, 4 to flush rivers. They don't improve our fold equity. They usually make it worse, because when we're playing as the PFR, we don't want draws to complete. But here we're playing as the pre-flop cold caller. You can see that these are some of the best runouts for us to actually fire that follow-up bet after float bet the turn. So just to give you a quick practical example of something that might occur, which would be a backwards thought process, is that let's say we're generally very good at firing a follow-up bet after we fire a float bet on the turn, but occasionally we catch a very specific river and we get worried about firing the second barrel. We miss an opportunity. But it doesn't happen too often because it's just rivers that seem scary, right? It's just flush completing rivers and four to flush river and four to straight river. But the rest of the rivers we fire. It might not sound like a big problem, but as you can see from this data, that means you're actually missing the best spots to fire. So what counterintuitively might feel like a bad spot when a bunch of draws get there, four to straight gets there, the four to flush, those are the spots you don't want to miss because, as we can see, these generate the highest amount of automatic profit. So if you did ever miss a spot, it would be better to occasionally miss a spot on a spot where the flush bricks or all of the draws brick, for example. Now, there are some situations which appear to be directly bad for us. So double pairs, and that's just a pattern we see. I'm not really sure there's any spot where double paired river is actually good for us. It just decreases the amount of fold equity we get. We don't always know the exact reason, but presumably players are just more likely to bluff catch with things like ace high, maybe even king high when there's a double pair out there in the hopes that we have a counterfeit pair. And in general, we don't like river pairs. Now, just looking at this data set, do we expect river pairs to have even less fold equity than double pairs? I would say no. We expect double pairs to be worse. I think river pairs might even be in the right place at 43%, but I think the fold on the double pairs texture is probably trending on the high side here. We could easily find that we just get 39, 40% fold equity. So we don't want to look at this and think that we might have a marginally plus EV bluff. It's break even at best, but in reality, and we can't prove this with the current data set, firing the river on a double paired river is probably losing. So just keep in mind, we want to add a few percent for card removal effects, because what we're seeing now is the folding frequency against every possible holding that can fire the river. And what actually happens in practice is when the aggressor has a value hand, the opponent's folding slightly more often due to card removal effects. We're analyzing this from the perspective of holding a pure bluff, which means that our opponent is not going to be folding at these frequencies when we are pure bluffing the river, because when we have a pure bluff, in most cases, the blocking effect is not going to be as severe as having a strong value hand, for example. So we don't expect these to be the actual folding frequencies. They could be up to 3% lower than the frequencies we see. So if we're assuming 40% break-even threshold, well, we really need 43 or 44% to be safe. So you can see from that context, double pairs is right on the line there in that spot. And seeing as we guess that it's trending on the high side anyway, we don't want to be relying on that as a profitable bluff spot. So specifically river pairs, don't worry about firing those. And don't worry about double paired rivers. Every other spot we want to fire. And generally, the more draw completing the river, the better it is for us. We do still like overcards. So that's one of the things that stays the same, regardless of whether we are the PFR or with the co-caller, is we like overcard rivers. So you can see overcard 49%, and that's 1% above the average, whereas non-overcard river is actually 48%, which is the average. Okay, let's have a quick look at the turn float bet situation itself, just to see if there's anything interesting in terms of board texture. So are there any specific float bet spots on the turn where we don't get as much fold equity? So just keep in mind here that the average is 53%. So we should just start by comparing these numbers to the average. So dry is slightly below, semi-dry is slightly above. This might just be variance. Dynamic, you can see, is lower. Overcard turn is, again, slightly lower. Non-overcard is very good for us and slightly above average. 51% flush bricks. This is turn textures, by the way, 51% flush completes. Pairs is ironically good for us on the turn. 4 straight, 4 flushes, double pairs. So you can see specifically on dynamic boards, it doesn't seem we get as much fold equity, but I don't think there's really any problem there. We usually have more pot equity on those types of turn cards anyway. So we can usually still fire aggressively even with the weaker parts of our range. So I don't think there's anything that we can really use there, but it's worth just checking. Now let's break this down by some additional variables. So first of all, we have texture, and that's specifically going to be flop texture. And then we have position or formation. So let's start by formation. And we're just going to compare early position versus late position formation. So the latest position incarnation of this is obviously going to be big blind versus small blind. And we can see, just keep in mind the average stat, by the way, so 53% and then 48% river follow-up. But specifically in big blind versus small blind, we've got 56% fold to turn float and 50% versus river follow-up. So you can see if you think a spot's close, then the next thing you might look at is, okay, are we in big blind versus small blind situation? Because if the answer is yes, then as you can see, we get more fold equity on the double barrel. So we should tend towards firing more aggressively. Just want to keep track of the averages as we do this. So 53% is the average. Keep that in mind. Let's have a look at cutoff versus button. So that's kind of late position, but you can see a little bit less fold equity than average for the turn float bet. In fact, we could describe this as like the average situation, right? Big blind versus small blind population folds more often against floats and follow-ups. Button versus cutoff, it's kind of average with 52 fold to turn float, 48 fold to river follow-up. But if we take something a bit more extreme, so we take button versus low jack, for example, as you can see, the numbers drop to 49% fold to turn float and then 47 fold to river follow-up. This is still clearly going to allow us to generate profit, even if we take low jack versus high jack, which doesn't look too bad, even looks slightly higher at 50%, still lower than average, of course. You can still see that it's worth keeping in mind that if we feel that a situation is very marginal, then formation could make the difference, but we can see that we still generate automatic profit across all formations. It's just a case of being aware that we could have, 5 or 6% less fold equity when we're comparing a late position formation versus an early position formation when deciding on a float bet and follow up. So let's have a look at texture. So this is not turn texture now. This is specifically how the pool plays against the turn float bet given a certain flop texture. And the easiest starting point here is usually by high card. So keeping in mind that 53% average, notice we've got 59% fold to turn float on an ace high, which seems very high, 56 on a king high, 51 on the queen jack high, 48% on the 10-9 high, and low textures 50% fold equity. So if anything, I would describe this as a slightly counterintuitive. Just in the sense that if you think about this from a pure flop float perspective, I guess this is really the interesting thing here. We know with flop floats that it should be the other way around, right? If you just look at this flop float data, so versus flop float, fold 45, king high, fold 46, queen jack high, fold 46, 10-9 high, fold 45, low, fold 48. So we get a slight increase in fold equity the lower the board is generally. And it's just simply because, when we have a lower board, it's generally going to be good for us as the cold caller. But assuming our opponent does c-bet the flop, we actually now get the reverse of that on the turn. So going back to the turn situation now, ace high is actually the most folded against the turn float bet. So everything's moving in the other direction. King high is 56, queen jack high 51, 10-9 high 48, low jumps up again to 50. We often see that pattern, by the way. We see a descending pattern, and then once we get too low, we see a slight increase in fold equity again. So this is a very common pattern we see. There's a very clear, defined pattern here. If anything, this is much more clearly defined than the versus flop float pattern we just looked at. Very, very clear trend from 59 to 56 to 51. And, it's a fairly dramatic trend as well. We're talking well over 10% range between the highest and lowest values. In fact, yeah, it's like 11%, right? Between 48 and 59. So the way to think about this, one of the explanations for this, and, the explanation is not always too important. More often, it's just what our opponent's doing that's important. But if you think about how aggressively players c-bet on an ace high, they're c-betting more aggressively, right? What that means is they're now more vulnerable to turn float bets. Once we start getting to the lower boards, they're more likely to have an equity-driven c-betting range. So although it might feel like we should get more fold equity because, when the flop's 10-9 high, that's a more favorable situation for us as the defender. It might intuitively feel like we should get more fold equity on the float bet on the turn, given the flop was good for us as the defender. We can see that it doesn't work like that. And the better the original flop was for the PFR, given that they don't barrel, the more fold equity we get on the turn float bet. So let's just have a look at some of the other textures. Monotone, we'll start with monotone. Monotone's always the craziest, just in the sense that everyone just seems to overfold monotones at every part of the game tree. It doesn't really matter what the situation is. If it's a monotone, someone's probably overfolding. See, 56% fold. Again, just keep track of the average here, 53%. So you can see monotone's 3% above average. Paired dynamic and paired dry. So if you take something like a paired dry, we usually expect that to be good for the PFR, but because this is specifically a turn float bet situation, we get above average fold equity. If we take something like a code red at the other end of the spectrum, that should be good for us on the flop, right? You know, especially if there's mid-range coordination. So we might feel like we're going to get more fold equity on the turn float bet, but as you can see, well below average here for population fold to turn float bet frequency after the flop was code red. Dynamic, similar kind of thing. Semi-dry, it's not good for the PFR, but specifically in turn float bet, that means that it's actually better for us. So if it's a flop that's good for the PFR and they don't barrel, then it turns into a situation that's good for us. Hopefully you can kind of see how that works. So there's a balance here because, you know, on the one hand, you know, we see a situation on the flop that's good for us. We obviously want to defend more often, but the ironic thing is that the turn float bet's not going to pick up the pot as often. Whereas when we see like an ace high board or king high board, we know that that's good for the PFR, and that is a legitimate reason to fold more often on things like ace high boards. But assuming our opponent doesn't barrel, we're going to get more fold equity on the turn float bet. And let's just see if that follows up to the river as well. I'm just going to cycle through these. I'm looking at the versus river follow up, and what we're really seeing is that that seems to be a solid 48% in most cases. Paired dry is a bit lower at 44. Paired dynamic, okay, monotone back to 48, dry 50, semi-dry 48, dynamic 50, code red 52. So there's a relationship here where, you know, if you get a little bit more fold equity on the turn, you get a little bit less fold equity on the river, that kind of thing. But there's not really too much interest in terms of how often the follow-up bet works based on flop texture. We're more interested in considering the follow-up bet based on river card texture. As we've seen, there's some fairly clear patterns for the river follow-up bet. Okay, before we move on to 3-bet pots, we just want to check out the average calling range for the population because it just reinforces what our value betting range should look like. You know, let's say how easily can we fire any top pair, for example, in a river follow-up situation after float betting the turn. So we usually use 50% equity for this because we need 50% equity to value bet. Although it's a fairly optimistic calculation, just in the sense that it is basically excluding raises from the population. So just keep this as a rough guide. This is not like scientific in the same way that bluff catching is. This is just a rough guide of what a value bet range should look like. You know, to have a really clear value bet, we might need to have 55% equity, for example, against the calling range, given that they sometimes raise, for example. So we've got air 1%, that's 6% with ace high, 16%, plus 21, 37, 54 is top pair, weak kicker. So you can see there that not every top pair weak kicker is going to have 50% equity, right? Let's just double check that. 16 plus 21, 37. Yeah. So top pair second kicker is always a value bet, but top pair weak kicker is not always a very clear value bet in this spot. It's kind of interesting, really. It might seem that we should just always double barrel top pair, but yeah, according to the data, it doesn't really seem to work like that. So actually, according to this data, if we do fire a top pair weak kicker, most of the time it's not good against the follow-up bet. I think in a lot of cases, it will hopefully be clear based on the river card. So we have to keep in mind that we're working with aggregate data here. I mean, if we rerun the same calculation for something like flush bricks, I mean, that's a spot where it's going to be more obvious that we should be firing 2 streets of value. Let's see if the numbers represent that. So here we've got 14, and then we've got 28% mid pair. So that takes us to 42%, right? So basically out of that 20% top pair weak kicker, 12% of that 20% is in the value betting range, whereas the bottom 8% is not. So even on a flush breaking river, we have to be slightly careful in the situation. So just keep that in mind. Top pair may not be a double barrel. Of course, it does always potentially depend on the sizing. That's something else to keep in mind as well. If we did have a weak top pair, presumably we're not going to 2/3 the river. So that's kind of another analysis vector we can take here, is to say, well, what specifically about half pot sizing, for example? We'll look at half pot. How clear is the value bet now with top pair, weak kicker? Let's add these numbers up. So I'm going to add the large numbers first. So 32, 38, 39 plus 17. So again, it's still not very, very clear even at the half pot region. I wouldn't say this is typical. I would say like most 2-barrel spots, top pair is generally fairly clean 2 streets of value. Although I don't always fire. Sometimes I set a trap depending on the situation, since these hands are not super strong anyway. But this spot doesn't look super great for extracting thin value, at least not with this data set. Okay, let's move on now to 3-bet pots. If you have any questions, just let me know in chat, by the way. So we're going to look at similar data points, but for 3-bet pots now. So if we think about a sample situation, so most common or most frequent iteration of this is we're going to be on the button, for example, we call a 3-bet from the big blind. Big blind does fire continuation bet. And, it's often 1/3 in today's games, but can sometimes be larger. We call the C-bet, then villain checks the turn. How often is villain falling to turn float bet in that situation? Well, let's start with the general data point. So we have 48% fall equity overall. Let's just have a look at that by different sizing points. And once again, we see that, although one sizing could be better than another, depending on the exact type of hand that we have, we are generating clear auto profit for every sizing here for the turn float bet situation. Half pot is working almost 50% of the time, which is kind of insane, really. 1/3 is working 25%. This is actually a very good situation. Now, we kind of have to counterbalance that with, keep in mind that the population is actually barreling 54% of the time. These numbers are high, by the way. If you want to follow the analysis path where you look at C-bet frequencies for the player pool, well, player pool is not meant to be C-betting 71% and barreling the turn 54%. So they are C-betting too wide. That's not necessarily great for turn float betting, because it means that we only get, after calling the flop, the turn float bet opportunity about 46% of the time. But assuming we do get that turn float bet opportunity, it's very profitable for us. Versus river follow-up, clear auto profit as well in this spot. And for every sizing point, it seems, we know for 3-bet pots, it's one of those situations where we can make use of the 1/3 sizing. So if you want to experiment with 1/3 turn float bet, 1/3 river follow-up bet, it is okay to do that according to the data. So it allows us to generate a fairly cheap bluff in a 3-bet pot. There are side effects of this. I mean, for example, it's lower variance, and that's what I like about it. In terms of red line, which really doesn't matter too much, the 1/3 bluff is not going to generate as high of a red line. It's not going to work as often. It doesn't need to work as often because it's a much cheaper bluff, but it doesn't work as often. And red line is often related to how often stuff works as well as the pot size. So larger bets tend towards generating a higher red line. The counterbalance to that is that when big bluffs fail, then they obviously hit the blue line much harder, for example, because you lose a much bigger pot showdown. So there's a trade-off here, but we don't really care about that. I mean, if you did care about that, you might want to stick to larger bluffs on the river if you want positive red line for whatever reason. But 1/3 river bluff is generating auto profit according to the data. Now let's have a look textually. One of the things that we saw for 3-bet pots is there's a very, very strong link between what the flop texture is and how effective flop float bets are. So it's barely worth firing flop float bets on ace high boards, but it's very good to fire float bets on things like 10 high boards, for example. There's a very strong link there. Now, we've seen with single raise pots that by the time you get to the turn float bet situation, things get flipped on their head. The cards which would have generated a lot of fall equity on the flop are not the ones that generate a lot of fall equity on the turn. So let's see if that's the case here. We're going to have a look at turn fold to float bet frequencies by flop texture in this spot. So just keep in mind the average stat here as well. So the average versus turn float is 48% in this spot. So let's have a look, for example, ace high. You can see versus turn float is 52%. So it's well above average. So in a spot where the turn card is not good for us, it's a high card, it's good for the 3-better, we're generating above average fold equity on the turn float bet. King high, you see that number decreasing. Queen jack high, it's now well below average. Right. So again, this might seem counterintuitive, but the board textures that we really like on the flop are not the same board textures that are good for float betting the turn. It's actually the board textures that we really dislike on the flop that end up being the best for float betting on the turn. So another way of thinking about this is that although our opponent's range connects with something like an ace high or king high board, it's actually a pretty big sign of weakness when our opponent attacks a board that's good for them and then doesn't continue that aggression on the turn. Whereas if our opponent attacks a board that's not good for them and doesn't continue that aggression on the turn, that's less of a sign of weakness. Maybe because they just had to be so strong or stronger on average to c-bet that bad board to begin with. So, you get the idea. Now let's just have a quick look at the calling range as well. One of the things we saw with the flop module is that there's a specific pattern. In fact, let's start with overall. And it's very often bluff catching type hands like mid pairs, that kind of region that are calling against flop float bets and proceeding to the river. So it's good to just have a look at the actual call versus turn float bet range as well. So this is check call versus turn float bet in 3-bet pots. We're just trying to get a feel for what is the most common type of hand someone has when they check call a float bet. And it is fairly mixed, but it is heavily weighted towards one pair. So you've got pair plus draw, under pair, low pair, mid, pocket pair, and over pair, the highest category hands. Top pair good kicker is up there as well. Top pair weak kicker, mid pair. You see, what does opponent have? Probably not a draw too much. Probably not trash too much because, why would they check call with trash, right? Unless it's specifically like ace, king high. That's probably what trash means in this case, is 2 good high cards. You can see that weighting towards a mid pair bluff catcher type holding. Not really too many draws, not really too many bluffs. Occasional traps. We saw that for the flop float bet scenario as well, as occasionally they're actually trapping something, but it's not really too often. Strongest kind of thing they're trapping is an overpair. These are legitimate traps. If you look at some of these hands, so 3-bet kings, c-bet on the jack 5-4, and then check a 5 turn. Like that's a trap, right? There's no way that this player's scared of the 5 turn. At least it seems unlikely to me. Some cases it may be this, which is they've c-bet a board that is, okay, but not great for them. And then they've caught a bad turn. What they should ideally do is keep on firing here, but just reduce their sizing. But what they instead do is they go into check call mode because they're scared of the turn card. So this is something that can happen as well. I see the same thing here with like queens and the 7-10 deuce. C-bet, get spooked by the turn card. What they should really do is continue firing, but instead they're actually going to check call mode. Kings, this might be a trap or it might be scared because the jacks are paired. Difficult to say. Aces, definitely scared, right? C-bet the flop. It's not great flop. Turns really bad, going to check call mode. That's like definite possible thing that can happen when, in terms of texture, it's very good for us as the defender, and then there's a draw completing turn card. Okay, so let's just have a quick look at these other textures. So let's start with monotone again. And again, keep in mind, average fold to turn float bet, 3-bet pots, 48%. So monotone fold 52% to turn float bet. Dry, 49%. Semi-dry, 48%. Dynamic, 44%. And code red, 45%. So very similar pattern. Paired dynamic, 42%. And paired dry, 46%. Okay, so paired dynamic seem especially bad, right? In fact, I think paired dynamic is the lowest out of everything at 42%. So that's something like a 10-10-9. And that's kind of approaching the threshold where it's barely worth float betting the turn, right? But let's just go back to that. Paired dynamic, 42%. Let's break that down by sizing. Actually doesn't look too bad by different sizings. Yeah, might just be the pool's using a larger size on average here, because when we break it down, we're still seeing consistent auto profit across the individual sizing ranges. Okay, fine. Let's have a look at formation just to wrap things up. Again, if you've got any questions, let me know, because we're going to look at formation, then we're going to wrap things up. So if there's something you want to ask, just let me know in chat. So once again, we're going to compare early position and late position formations just to get a feel for how much it impacts on the efficiency or the fold equity we get with a float bet. Again, just keeping in mind that 48% average fold to turn float bet. Let's start with late position incarnation, which is button versus big blind. One of the things that we saw for the flop float bet situation is we saw a fairly big difference depending on whether the three bets in the small blind or the big blind. It might seem like it should be the same, but interestingly, we found that pool is folding a lot more in the small blind to flop float bets than in the big blind, like 5% more, for example. So let's start by just comparing two late position formations. So button float turn versus big blind, we've got 48% fold to turn float bet, which is our average. And then button versus small blind, we've got 50%. So it seems maybe things have evened out slightly, but just like period, the small blind's a better target for attacking with float bets, whether it's flop or turn, than the big blind. Okay, let's have a look at a late position or early position formation now. So we got big blind versus button, fold to turn float 48. If we have a look at big blind versus UTG, so we've actually called a big blind 3-bet from UTG, for example, big blind C-bet the flop. We've now flop bet the turn. You can see 43 and 45. Let's break that down by sizing. I was still generating automatic profit. So it's fairly similar to single raise heads up pots. It's obviously not as good to be attacking someone after the 3-bet against our early position open, but we are still generating auto profit. And if you compare big blind versus UTG and small blind versus UTG, once again, we get that spike in fold equity when playing against a small blind. So regardless of the formation, we see that pattern where big blind is folding more often to flop floats, also folding more often to turn float bets. Sorry, the small blind is folding more often to float bets, whether it's flop or turn, whereas big blind's folding less to float bets, regardless of the formation. But we also see that in early position battles, pool is folding slightly less, not by enough to stop us generating auto profit. But, who knows, combine this with other variables, maybe things start to look less favorable. So there could be some situations you want to avoid. I mean, for example, let's try and stack some variables and see what we find. So the worst iteration of this is big blind versus low jack at the moment. Well, ideally, we'd do this by flop texture, but we can't combine both without an additional filter. But what we could do is have a look at the code red texture or paired dynamic texture, specifically big blind versus low jack, and you might find there are situations where the variables stack and we don't generate automatic profit, for example. But as far as we can see with this data point, we should still be firing at air hands in most spots. Right, so Mr. Bolt says, is it worth doing analysis on float flop SNG compared to float turn and barrel? I don't think that's necessarily the right comparison. Because we don't decide which of those two lines to take, right? Like our opponent's deciding this for us, depending on whether he c-bets the flop. So there would be other comparisons that we take. For example, if our opponent checked, then we would compare float bet SNG to delayed c-bet and follow up. If our opponent does bet and we call, we're now comparing float bet turn to delayed float bet line, right? In that situation. We can certainly have a look at delayed float. I think it makes sense. That's really the comparison in this part of the game tree is, do we directly float bet the turn or do we go for a delayed float bet? I would usually say, unless there's some kind of dynamics where your opponent is going to figure out if you're float betting too aggressively, I would mostly just go for the float bet and follow up. But it's good to be aware of the other option as well, which is the delayed float bet. So if for whatever reason we don't float bet the turn with trash, the delayed float bet line is going to generate automatic profit as well. Let's just have a quick look at the numbers. In fact, this may be, yeah, this is delayed flop float. I think we actually want delayed turn float, right? Which I don't have. I don't have in this particular output. We'd have to rerun a different analysis. It's fairly similar to, for example, c-bet flop and delayed c-bet flop. It's just that this is obviously now like a turn and river situation. This is float bet turn versus delayed turn float bet, which is a line that takes place on the river. And it's kind of similar in the sense that we get more fold equity, but we don't 100% get the opportunity. So if you had access to the delayed turn float bet numbers, then it's definitely worth thinking about running some comparisons. If anything, probably would just base it on opponent for now. I mean, there could definitely be some textural things you could look for where you might find on certain textures, it's better to go for the delayed float bet. I mean, just to kind of put this together based on the data we've seen in today's session, we've said, for example, that we get less full equity in a spot where the board's actually good for us. So if it was like a 10-9 X board, we call the flop c-bet, then our opponent checks to us. It's potentially going to make more sense with complete trash to go for a delayed turn float bet in that situation, right? Whereas in a situation that's very good for us, so it's been an ace or king high flop, villain has c-bet the flop. Now we know that we get a spike in fold equity on the direct turn float bet. So it's going to make more sense to go for the double barrel. That would be like a really intelligent way of balancing up your lines, I think. Mostly at the time of creating this video, mostly I just attack the turn float bet spot, but specifically against very good regs, I mix things up. I don't necessarily mix things up by texture, but I think after looking at the numbers today, you can see that there's possibly a resource there where if the board texture is like ace high, king high, we go for direct turn float bet. Whereas if the board is more like 10 high, jack high, we tend towards going for the delayed turn float bet on the river rather than the direct turn float bet and follow up. And that's pretty much what we do, in other parts of the game tree. Like if we're comparing flop c-bet to delayed turn c-bet, what we tend towards doing is attack more on boards that are good for us and tend towards going for delayed c-bet on boards that are not so good for us. So here, board like ace high is very good for us. We go for the direct turn float bet. Something's like 10 high, not so good for us. We can instead go for the delayed turn float bet rather than the direct turn float bet. Which is actually kind of an unbalanced way of playing. But if you take the average of that strategy, it looks balanced. Unless our opponents actually break it down by specific textures, which they probably won't, it looks like it's a balanced strategy. You could, of course, if you needed additional balance, mix within that. So, you could generally avoid direct turn float bets on a 10 high board, for example, but occasionally float bet with some weaker holdings if your opponents were very good. Let's see what Yon says. You are on the flop c-bet 3-bet, maybe on flop c-bet single raise pot, you have delayed turn float. Yeah, we can have a quick look. So let's head to single raise. Let's see what we've got. There is a specific, we do have a specific versus turn float bet pop up, but I don't have the report compiled for that because obviously we have to break things down. When we have this very large database, we can't just run a report for the whole Death Star. So to have like the 40 million hands, everything's broken down into reports. So some reports we don't have everything. Okay, so let's go to single raised heads up. Right, so versus delayed float, but we want versus delayed turn float. So you can kind of see the problem. We have delayed float, but that's actually the line where we don't float bet the flop, but instead of float bet the turn. What we're really looking for is a line where we don't directly float bet the turn, but instead go for the delayed turn float bet on the river. And you can see we don't actually have that here. But I do think it's on the versus turn float. But the thing with the versus turn float pop-up on the Death Star is it's not broken down by all of these variables. I don't think it even has the 3-bet pot data. And there's no reason for it in the sense that, we should have those filters. It's just that we can't add anything else to the Death Star without causing crashes. That's really the problem we have. So that's why we're using flop c-bet OOP, because everything's already broken down by different variables. But of course, like the downside is we don't technically have the versus delayed turn float bet on this output for single raised or 3-bet pots. But we do know it's higher. So without needing the data, we know that pool folds more often to delayed turn floats than they do to direct float bets on the turn. But obviously there's an opportunity cost in that if we don't float bet the turn, sometimes our opponent's going to SNG the river OOP, and then we don't get the opportunity to delayed float bet. But the cool thing is that that's not always as much of a problem as it sounds, because we are increasingly comfortable with just raising against the SNG line in the 3-bet pot, right? The pool plays bet check bet. We can just raise against the SNG. As you can see, even on this output, this is single raised. We've got 57% full equity on the raise against the SNG. We do like this to be above 60, but it's pretty high in 3-bet pots as well, as far as I'm aware. 58% fold to SNG. So although there's an opportunity cost in the sense that we don't always get to delayed turn float bet the river, if we don't get that opportunity, then we get the opportunity to raise the river. So it's worth keeping that in mind as well, that are we really giving up that much? So I would say logical thing to do here is, in summary, if it's like a high card turn, tend towards float betting directly. If it's a lower texture, you could say something like jack high or lower. Queen could be like the pivot point where you sometimes mix, but like jack and lower, just always go for the delayed float bet, the delayed turn float bet. That should be the lower frequency thing anyway, because I think it's more likely there's like a higher card out there at this stage. So most turns you go for the direct float bet and follow up, because there's going to be a high card out there like an ace or a king or a queen. Other textures, we actually go for the delayed turn float bet. So that kind of adds a layer of pseudo balance to our strategy. It's not technically balanced if you look at every single texture, but it's more balanced on average, because we're not going to be float bet bluffing the turn as much. We've got some air hands that check back and go for the delayed turn float bet, but we're actually randomizing by texture, which is leveraging this data we can see right now, which is different folding frequencies depending on the turn card. Mr. Bolt says, I've tried adding some of the float stats like float SNG to the versus CBET pop-ups and it continually crashed. Right, so just since you mentioned this, now, for example, I don't even know if my hand to note will crash if I open config. Let's see if it crashes. Actually, looks like it's going to crash. All right. I'm not sure if it will. Let's find out. So we'll see if it crashes, and then I'll explain what's going on here. Okay, so it's crashed, right? Now, question is, why did it crash? So the reason why it crashed is I had to create some additional stats. Like I needed 4-bet pot formation stats. So I created a bunch of additional 4-bet pot stats earlier. And I know that it's going to cause a crash. And that used to be something that was kind of terrifying. But it doesn't really bother me too much, because you see, what I realize is I can just go into the filters folder and I could just delete those newly created stats. Okay, so long as I don't open config, I can just go and delete those stats. Then when I fire up hand to note, I can access the config section again. The other interesting thing is, even if your hand to note in a non-operational state, like for example, mine is clearly non-operational, right? This is something that I did earlier today. Like it was working fine earlier today. I had to create some extra stats for 4-bet pots for analysis. Obviously I would love to just include those in the Death Star, but I can't, because this is what will happen to hand to note if I do. But I do periodically create additional stats. So I've created a bunch of stats. I've, keeping in mind that at no point have I opened configuration since I've been doing this, because I know it'll probably crash. I create a new range research report. I copy and paste my newly created mass clone stats. I run the report completes. And it's possible to access those stats in the range research report. I just can't use configuration. So I can add as many stats as I want. They will process in a range research report. But of course, the problem is that now I can't use config. So what do I have to do? I just have to fire up program files, and I have to delete those extra stats pretty much. As soon as I delete those extra stats, the configuration is going to start working. Of course, the associated range research report that I've created is going to stop working at the same time. So I'm okay with my hand to note being broken because I know how to fix it. And that's just to go into filters. The newly created stats will have a date range, like they have a date next to them in Windows. So you can very easily just sort by date. And you can see, okay, like these are the 500 extra definitions I mass cloned earlier. Just delete them from the folder. Fire up hand to note again. Your config will work. But obviously now you've lost the extra reports that you've built. So I'm continually building new reports, but then I have to delete them afterwards. Like that's like the situation of things right now. But this whole session has been run on a broken version of hand to note, as you can see. So it's not necessarily something to be terrified of. Obviously, we're pushing the limits of what we should be doing with hand to note. It can't really cope with this amount of stats. So yeah, I have some work to do with that report. And then once that report's done, I'll just delete those new stats and then everything's going to be okay. So anything that we've looked at today, for example, if you want to break stuff down, one of the things that I really like to do is I've got formation. We've got broken down by formation. We've got stuff broken down by flop texture, but sometimes I want it broken down by both, right? Or I want it broken down by several variables at the same time. Like I want specific position, texture, and sizing, for example. And they don't exist in the Death Star, but you can make them so easily with a mass clone. So you just make them, run the range research report, delete the stats afterwards when you have your data, and just move on from there. All right, cool. Let's call that a session. Thanks very much for your attention, guys. Good luck with the grinds, and I'll see you next time.